Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. I'm your host, Chase, and today we're bringing you an all-star panel featuring Steve Birkett, founder of Plug and Play EV. He's the king of all things NEVI and EV charging, along with Walter Schulze, the data-driven mind behind the Network Architect channel on YouTube. And last but not least, Eric Way. He's the experienced EV road tripper and voice of the News Coolum channel. Together, we'll dive into the trends of 2024 and how they're shaping the EV industry, charging infrastructure, and the future of mobility. This isn't just about what's happening now, it's a blueprint for what's coming in 2025. From the latest in DC fast charging reliability to current EV models, our guests share unparalleled insights around what is happening in the space today. Plus, we unpack the big wins, surprising challenges, and the current state of electric transportation. So what's in store? Well, how about how fast charging hubs and streamlined plug-in charge tech are redefining the road trip experience? The rise of vertically integrated networks like Electric Era and their game-changing impact on DC fast charging for EV drivers, along with what automakers and EV buyers can expect as federal incentives shift and private investment skyrockets. This is an episode packed with interesting takeaways and eye-opening perspectives that you won't want to miss. Love what you hear? Well, share this episode with someone who's passionate about the future of electric vehicles as well. Plus, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more EV enthusiasts discover Grid Connections. With that, enjoy. I'm sure all of our listeners are familiar, but just in case, and there will be obviously, as we always do, links in today's show notes, but real quickly, if you guys could just kind of go around, in addition, obviously, talking about Coast to Coast EVs, what you do fortnightly, but just what you individually do and your backgrounds for our listeners today.
So I'm Steve from Plug and Play EV, a YouTube channel based out of Boston, Massachusetts, and the back of my car quite often. So I cover a lot of infrastructure and electric vehicle everything really, reviews, product reviews, travel, that kind of thing around the Northeast and more recently across the country. And we also do, with the fine gentleman to my left and down below, the fortnightly Coast to Coast EVs podcast, which is a live stream on YouTube, but also makes its way to audio platforms to cover EV infrastructure and the EV news and analysis of the day.
Thank you, Steve. Why don't you go next, Walter? I'm just looking on the boxes on my screen. I'll have you go next.
Yeah, Walter Schulze. I work at the Network Architect channel, YouTube channel, to produce content, typically on DC fast charger station builds and also site visits. And I've been mentored by Eric and his site review method, so I've been taking that as the way when I show up to a site to do a review, that's the method that I follow in order to do reviews. So I'm definitely the junior member of the team.
And last but not least, Eric, why don't you tell a little about yourself?
Yeah. I was just figuring we'd go in alphabetical order by last name after Steve started. So
that makes too much sense, but of course, that's not how it works here on the Grid Connection podcast.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been driving electric vehicles for quite a while now. I actually just did a road trip in my Chevy Volt that replaced the one I had before. So I've actually been driving plug-in vehicles now for 13, almost 14 years. So quite a long time. And then, of course, I transitioned to all electric about 8 years ago. And what I do basically is a YouTube channel just covering the infrastructure, best practices for traveling, that sort of thing. I saw a real dearth in coverage, especially people talking about the public charging infrastructure early on, which is kind of why I got into doing a video channel on YouTube to kind of document it. And, Walter referenced that site review model that I created. And I've been remiss in not doing as many site reviews as I need to, but it was just a way of providing some analytics and quantifying the things about charging sites that really matter to EV owners, because, we've seen so many chargers going in that are not like focused on the customer. They're not focused on the EV driver. They're focused on a business or something else. And these are factors that people who actually drive EVs and use chargers are interested in. So it's something that was worth mentioning. And so, yeah, I just kind of cover all topics EV, but primarily trying to focus on the infrastructure because I feel like that's what affects us all, really. So.
For sure. And I know we have a few different topics that we wanted to cover for tonight, but let's kind of just start. You mentioned, Eric, even road tripping. So I think, Steve, we had you on earlier this year as well, kind of talking about the big road trip you took across the entire country, actually. So I think it might be interesting just kind of talk with all three of you having you on, and even my recent experiences doing the annual road trip I do down to Phoenix, and just kind of hear any trends or insights that all three of you are kind of seeing in that realm. As far as I think there's a lot of headlines and there's a lot of facts on paper, but in the end, there is reality. And I will say personally, as someone who's been driving EVs for a while, things are getting better, but there are still the occasional headwinds or unexpected issues. So I'm curious to hear what your experiences have been. And if you guys have had any trips that you want to share recently, we'll kind of kick it off with that.
Well, I'll send people straight back to the episode we did, Chase, of 60 minutes or more of my trip across the country. So everyone should go back and listen to that.
Yeah,
after
that was a
this.
great episode.
Eric has definitely had some recent travel, right, Eric? Northern California. I think it's probably worth starting on your coast and heading east.
Oh, you want to start on the West Coast? Okay. Well, I mean, I was going to say one trend that immediately jumped to my mind when you mentioned that, Chase, is reliability has improved. And I want to say specifically for Electrify America, I feel like they've been sort of the big bad that people pick on all the time. And I don't know that they've received enough credit or acknowledgement for how much they've actually improved their reliability in the last year alone. We've seen that fourth generation hardware going in, and it's going in very rapidly. So it's not just putting in new sites, but it's actually replacing aging equipment or problematic equipment. And so that's one of those areas that I feel like is really worth calling out. I personally try to avoid focusing on Electrify America, but I do think that we need to give them a little bit of credit for the improvements they've made in their reliability. But the other trend that I've noticed, and maybe it's really weird because I follow the East Coast in the middle of the country as well, even though I don't get out there as often, but I'm seeing a rise of these smaller charging networks that are really starting to get their footing and really starting to build out. And Chase, I believe you had a representative from Electric Era on at one point.
Yeah, that's
in time
actually something I want to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've made it a point now to kind of go out of my way checking out some of the Electric Era sites that are going in Northern California, and they're doing an amazing job. I think just so far I've visited 3 of their sites, all of them four 200 kilowatt dispensers, split power, all located at gas stations, all a block off the freeway. You know, all this complaining about I have to drive a mile off the freeway to get to a charger. They're literally exit the freeway and you're there, right? I've had one issue in I think 4 charging stops, and it was related to the payment card reader. And the next time when I went, it was fixed, right? So they have a really good uptime. The chargers are working. They're dispensing the power that they're rated. And one of the big things that I've noticed is they are getting these chargers installed ahead of schedule, which for someone in California, that just doesn't happen, right? Like this idea that they have, I think they got a contract with Costco because they had a 7-week turnaround time. In California, the station I visited most recently was in Wairika. They were initially targeting a spring 2025 opening date. And they're like, oh, well, we got the hardware ahead of schedule. We're just opening the site now. So they're done. Like it's online, it's ready to go. So like this is something that we don't see, and so they're kind of right now in the terms of these smaller, lesser known charging providers kind of the cream of the crop in terms of what I've observed. I do have my criticisms though, right? And I'm nothing if not a critic. And I do recognize that they fit a very small niche of what I consider relatively low power, average power per stall. So about 100 kilowatt per stall if the site is completely, swamped. No pull through parking, no canopies, but they serve that niche of you're in a smaller, efficient car, you're not towing a trailer, you just want a reliable charger with a quick 10, 15-minute top up off the freeway. You're in, you're out, it's reliable, you know it's going to work, and you have on-site amenities that you would have at a gas station. That goes a long way for a lot of drivers. And I think that is a niche that has not really been supported up to this point. So that's kind of top on my mind, but I've talked enough already. So
yeah, I was going to say, you just said so much that I want to unpack there. I don't know if Walter and Steve, you want to have anything to add to that, but for sure, Electrify America and Electric Air, I have definitely some recent experiences and thoughts on that realm as well. Steve or Walter, I don't know if you've had any recent experiences with either of those providers.
Nope.
Yeah, I think there's still there are a few kind of out locations that they've had kind of popped up across the U.S., but by far they're still much more West Coast based. And you're correct. We've had Quincy Lee, their CEO, on the Grid Connections podcast, and their team are rock stars.
Yeah. One thing that I have noticed in a trend as of late is innovation to solve the longstanding problem of, as you say, station lead time from construction to activation. And there's a lot of innovation in this area with Revel and Gravity, which Steve could probably speak to. And Electric Era has got some very creative solutions. So it's not only putting chargers in the ground, it's solving other problems as well. And that's one of the things that I've been noticing in the industry is that there's a lot of innovation coming to the table now.
I think the site that Eric mentioned in Wairika was suffering. The middle of 2025 was down to the transformer lead times. I don't know if they just got bumped up a list or if they were able to source. I know there's some creative work going out there on, pre-sourcing transformers or getting a jump on those things. But they definitely were way ahead. They just carried on building and then got it live. Obviously, as Eric's visit is a testament to.
Yeah, but I mean, speaking to that, Steve, in that same region, so if you go a little bit south on I-5 to Weed, I talked to the installers at the Pilot Flying J, and they had completed the Tesla V 3.5 supercharger the same weekend that they completed the Pilot Flying J. And the next time I went up there a month later, the supercharger was on and working and dispensing power, and it was still another month and a half after that before the Pilot Flying J went up. And it wasn't a transformer issue because they both supposedly had power drops. So there is some jostling, I think, to get in the lead in terms of whether it's site approvals or sign-offs or something. And if you know how to play that game, apparently in California, it gets you ahead. So
it's an interesting. Now that you're mentioning it, there's also an overlap with the NEVI progress that I've been monitoring because I've tried to keep it. It's a little bit more of a cluster of sites, so there's only 42 I think at the moment activated. So I've kept an eye on when they break ground or when the state DOT is saying they're under construction, that kind of thing, and then when they've actually started charging cars. That's typically my metric of they're open and ready to go. And the turnaround time there has varied from the quickest one was in Hawaii for, I think they started and finished in February this year, so even that's a short month, so something like 28 days. But that's a municipal site. They had tritium hardware already pre-bought, so this is, they're well positioned to turn that around, and it's a sunny place, so there's no weather delays really, unless some tsunami comes washing in. But the longest is I think it was Pilot Flying J in Ohio, which may not still be open. But again, they've got 16, 17 sites. Some of them Pilot Flying J that opened within a couple of months. Some of them that have really dragged on to 200, 220 odd days. And so you start to see, even with the same provider owned and operated by the person who's putting them in on their property, just maybe local contractors, maybe the equipment, all of these things that can move the goalposts. And, some sites will be up and running in a couple of months. Others may take, 4, 5, 6 longer. It just kind of really depends on what's going on the ground, I think.
I think there's a couple things to add to that. I know in Electric Air's case, they have their focus is vertical integration, and they have taken that to a pretty strong extreme between not just the hardware layer, but obviously software as well. And I know some of the veterans that they've recruited, not just from ex-Tesla, but other charging companies as well. There have been some really interesting learnings around like how to actually do what exactly we're talking about right now. That's execute a lot faster than some of these other players in the space, especially if they're not as vertically integrated. And to be honest with you, I still don't know what some of these tricks are. I just know in conversations I've had with people offline, they do confirm there are tricks, as we've kind of alluded to with the jostling, that they have learned from the industry that they are leveraging. They won't tell me what these tricks are, but they are saying that has really helped with acceleration in development. Obviously, I'm not always a big one to talk about rumor, but it's just been an interesting trend. And since you brought it up, and just things I've kind of confirmed when talking with others in the industry.
Yeah. I mean, it just stands out to me, though, Chase, because California is such a particularly harsh environment in terms of opening DC chargers. Electrify America had mentioned several years ago that their average opening time for California was double the national average. And so that's a pretty harsh environment.
That doesn't surprise me. And I don't think that is necessarily... I call it the I-5 curse, personally. A lot of the cities along I-5 in the whole West Coast are definitely much more onerous from a permitting standpoint. And it doesn't matter if you're in EV charging or not. Just having a lot of friends who are contractors and others in related kind of real estate development spaces, it just takes a long time. And obviously, California, I think, is the one everyone talks about. But this is something we do see in multiple states along the West Coast, unfortunately. I think it is finally starting to change with new entrants like Electric Air and others. But I think it's just interesting going also, not to just focus on them, Electrify America. I definitely agree that their experience has definitely improved. And I recently did, doing my annual kind of trip from, I didn't do the full 1,200 miles in a day like I've done previously. I only did 800 this time from Bend, Oregon to Las Vegas. And I did use an Electrify America to kind of take this different route that I hadn't driven in an EV. I'd done it ages ago in a Subaru, actually. And you go along what's known as the loneliest highway in the U.S. And it's incredibly beautiful and remote. But there was an Electrify America charger I used in Battle Mountain, Nevada. Okay. And it was probably the best EA experience I've ever had. Having said that, the app was incorrect with how many stalls were available. And then one of the stalls, just everything looked like it should work, but it did not. And so I did have to move. And then once I moved to this other 350 kilowatt stall, it kicked off and everything worked great.
Were they all the new 350s, or was this one of the old kind of hybrid?
So correct. So yeah, there were some of the new ones. But I think, kind of talking about earlier, Eric's experience and how he ranks charging experiences. I think there are one that's so spot on, and that is a great rubric, and to just have like kind of a base starting point for that. But then I always approach it from like people like my mom or other people I know who are very tech adverse people. And if I was one of them, I would be so frustrated because everything looks like it should be working. It would I would swipe my card and it would even say processing. It everything just seemed like it would work. And then it would just say fault on the car. And then the car would say there was an issue with the charger. And I pretty quickly knew it was the charger, but I had some time. And so I was just kind of playing with it to see, is there a weird thing? Is there anything that it could be on my side? Or are there any weird things I can do to make it work? And it was just really clear that it was just some sort of weird thing going on with the charger. And then once I plugged into the other stall, it worked fine, and I was on my way pretty quickly. And I think what's interesting is with a lot of Electrify America, it's definitely improved. And to be honest with you, the experience I had with Electrify America is not far off in user experience and issues I've experienced when using gas stations in very remote areas. There's usually a pump that's down or something kind of going on. So it's getting better. And the card swipe action was really quick when I went to the other one, and it all just worked. And I was a little nervous just because it was in a very remote area, or a pretty remote area. And this was kind of like the long one before a long drive into a slightly less remote area. But it all worked out. It was overall a pretty positive experience. But it just kind of goes to things are going in the right direction.
It's an interesting comparison as well. I mean, Walter did a
Yeah.
video on this as well recently. I'm sure he'll be a better place to speak to it. But the point of this transition eventually is that it should be easier. I mean, Chase, from
For sure.
traveling in the Tesla with plugging it in and going in a private ecosystem, closed network that just works right off the bat. Now, there's a lot more going on with these, third-party vendors and talking to another layer of software and everything else. But when we get this plug and charge, fixed across all public options and across all models and all network providers, then we start to get to a place where it's actually not even as difficult as gas. It's
sure.
You're not having to pump, you're not having to use, unless
Exactly.
you really want to. They will need credit card readers just for exactly the reason you say. Your mom or your dad or your grandma and people going on, chips that don't necessarily have it all set up, but that will be a backup, because once the car is handling everything in the background with the station, you're not doing anything. You're doing exactly what Tesla owners have been used to for all those trips, and just plugging in and walking away. But Walter, you did the video on that and covered it in pretty good detail. I'd love to hear what you're seeing on that.
Thank you. Subsequent to that, it's been uncovered. We're looking at a very fast transition to this plug and charge technology. One of my viewers chimed in and started feeding me some images from his BMW app. And BMW already has the plug and charge starting to show up in their app. And it appears as though what's going on is they're lining up with the Iona launch for plug and charge, this new, what I'm calling a parent plug and charge, which coalesces the disparate plug and charge and auto charge technologies into a single authentication commerce marketplace sort of thing, where the authentication transfers through transparently to the end user. And we're looking at it very fast. I mean, we're talking weeks away from this actually going live nationwide with all parties. And he showed me his app. It had EVgo, it had ChargePoint, and he actually went to the Mercedes-Benz charging hub in Sandy Springs and tried it. And what was displayed on the screen was plug and charge error, indicating that the feature is known within the software. It's just not working right now. So very soon, two things are going to be happening. We're going to be standardizing on J3400, and we're going to have plug and charge. Just think. Plus, I'm currently tracking somewhere around $50 billion of investment going into the United States and Canada for DC fast chargers. So you've got builds of crazy extent going all over the place. You've got plug and charge coming to the table very soon, and you've got J3400 standardization going all over the place. It's going to be a dramatically different landscape come this time next year. We're going to be talking all kinds of different things occurring. And as was mentioned, the gold standard of the Tesla supercharger experience coming to EV ownership at large.
Yeah, that's great to hear, because that's one of the things I've been pushing for so long. Because to me, you look at any sort of disruptive force, and for something to kind of take over the status quo, it doesn't have to be just as good. It has to be better. And that's really where that plug and charge experience has always shined. And I know between automakers and OEMs, it's definitely where things are headed. And I think that is the big thing that just cannot happen soon enough. Now, obviously, that's for EA and quite a few of these providers, as even you mentioned. I will say I did have probably the low point of my trip was I'm trying to look it up right now. It was the Champs Chevron in Austin, Nevada, which was it's a beautiful drive, and it's a wildly remote area. But I'm trying to remember what it even is as far as the provider. But it's one of these one-off.
There's a charge point along that route. Was it a charge point?
I'm pulling it up right now. I don't think it was. I think it was something else. but it just, and I'm trying to remember, I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on this, but one of the other crazy parts too was how difficult it was to get it to start a charge. And I think this is by far a one-off because it was only about 50 kilowatts. And that's what it was too. It was, DC was 75 cents a kilowatt hour and 60 cents to connect. And because the system wasn't working, it was just free. And so there was just like a lot of these weird issues with it. And so this was also another time where it looked like both chargers were working, but one was also down. This one was a little bit easier to figure out. It was down just because it was kind of acting weird, and I checked it in PlugShare previously showing up there. But it's just one of these things that, like, I feel sorry for people that this these are one-offs, but it's in such a remote area, and if you are doing this drive and you don't have some like 400-mile vehicle, which there's only a couple of, it is just like such an important thing to have. And the sooner that these do go to exactly what you're talking about, Walter, that just kind of minimize, because like there's one way to do it. You had to have like RFID, you had to do all these other things. So are those the ones that will be supported?
Yeah,
with...
on the BMW app, this is currently what is displayed. So it's Blink, Flow, Francis Energy, EVgo, ChargePoint, Iona. So all those Shell Recharge, all those apparently are going to be participating members in this new plug-in charge. So as you say, the one-offs will still exist.
Yeah,
but at least we're getting some very, very quick adoption apparently going on here.
No, that's great. And I think to even say as a counterpoint, my trip back, so we went to Phoenix, stayed at a resort for the holidays or Thanksgiving, and then on our way back we took a different way to go through Yosemite, and then leaving Yosemite we charged at a supercharger in Bakersfield. And we've kind of been talking about this a little bit, Eric, before we went live here, but the big part was it was a new V4, so the actual charging experience was great, but we pull up and my wife has to use the bathroom like crazy. And so she's like running around trying to find a place. And the place that allegedly had been said that you can go use the bathroom, they're now no longer letting EV charger people charging their EVs use the bathroom there. And my wife's like, okay, I got cash, $10. I don't care. I just need to use the bathroom. And they were just kind of putting their foot down about it, which was an unfortunate thing because from my point, it was the first V4 charger I had. So it doesn't really matter to my car. It was kind of the same all the way, but it was just kind of interesting to look at the site design and some of these other things. But it totally goes to kind of that grading rubric that we alluded to earlier, that there are a lot of different factors that go into this. For me personally, when I'm on a road trip, I just want to have charging. I don't really care what the amenities are there. If there's a simple bathroom thing and there's no canopy, whatever, I just want to have charging. But I think a lot of the stuff that you've been kind of following along, Walter, it is really great to see more and more of these more advanced and kind of just more fleshed out charging locations and charging experiences. And I think that is also another kind of part to this change to electrification that really does need to make sure that the gas experience, even if you're at a convenience store, there's usually a bathroom or something there that really does make it a lot less stressful when road tripping. And I'm kind of curious if there's anything you want to add to that, Walter, and some of the things you've been seeing.
Yes, and I think the longstanding pattern of Eric's approach to grading chargers as a customer experience has, believe it or not, had a rather extensive effect, because Tesla, left to its own devices, as you say, would put chargers in the ground at locations where people could charge their cars. But even Tesla now is shifting their focus to a more customer experience at their supercharger locations. There's several new ones in North Carolina, in my area, that are at very nice locations directly off the interstate, paired with a convenience store operator and extensive charging infrastructure. It's really a noticeable shift in the Tesla supercharger team, and all these other CPOs that are starting to focus more on customer experience as well, I think is because what we've been chiming about all these years is that, it's not just about getting gas at a pump that is unattended in the middle of nowhere. As you say, I'd like to use the restroom. I kind of like to be protected from the elements, and I'd like to have somewhere to dump my trash, and I'd like to have maybe somewhere to get some food or some fresh water or something. So all these things are well known in the gas industry and perfected down to a fine decimal point. And it seems as though the EV charging industry is finally starting to catch up.
I think it's also down to competition, right? I mean, you're starting to get, it's not just a Tesla supercharger or an Electrify America, and you go to the one that's, you're able to get to because your range gets you there. You've got, if I look back, I always kind of stop into Ellensburg, Washington as the stop where I got off the interstate and thought, there's 5 options here. I could go downtown, I could go to the Pilot Flying J, I could go to the Tesla supercharger with a Magic Dock, so even for my Ioniq 5 pre-adapter, it's ready to go. There's an Electrify America that's been upgraded, so it's all coming together. But you can't rest on your laurels. I mean, even a Tesla supercharger, which a year ago would have been the I can charge at Tesla finally. In that particular location, I think it's at a hotel, which might work great if you're staying at the hotel, but it means that you need to walk 2 or 3 businesses down to the dining. So it comes down to obviously your use case and your road trip, but also there's just other places to go now. If someone gets off an interstate, they may have 3, 4, 5 options, and that's a great thing for moving EV charging from the old days of just I hope anywhere has a charger to where do I want to stop, where do I want to charge.
No, I think that's a great call, especially that location of being right off the highway. And I think that is also what was really interesting about this supercharging location. I just double checked. It only opened 21 days ago. So it's only been open for a few weeks. And it was one of the new V4s. But as I was looking up, what was really interesting was even the route planner actually had not been recommending for me to go to that one. Because it technically was further off, but because it was kind of a V4 and we were kind of staying out to the east side of it anyway, I just figured why not go there. But you're totally right. I think there are so many areas, especially as we look into the new year, of areas to where to be optimistic, and finally getting to this point where I think this has been true even to Walter's point of like, you really don't have to go that far off the highway usually. And it's becoming more and more, especially along big interstates where you actually have choice in where you charge. And that has been something I look at more as just like the price and then amenities as to where I would go to kind of choose and how fast I'm trying to get somewhere, honestly.
Yeah, but Chase, I think your experience, I'm having a little bit of PTSD because my bones hurt. I'm an oldie. When I was traveling way back in the past, RV parks were still a very valid location for charging your car on a road trip. This is back when you're talking about 150, 200, 300 miles between superchargers, let alone, public fast chargers. And I started seeing a lot of pushback about 7, 8 years ago where RV park owners were just saying no more EVs, right? So it's one thing if every other week or something you have an EV owner stop in and plug in, but it's once you get that many numbers. And we've already seen this with gas stations, and I can't remember who I made this comment to, but people forget that even with a gas station, if all you do is pull your car in, fill up with gas, and go in and use the bathroom and leave, that gas station's lost money on that transaction, right? They have literally lost money because their margins on selling the gasoline are so low that you've used more of their resources than what they recouped. And so that's why we even see gas stations now say customers only using the bathroom. And that includes people who pull in to plug in or to use the gas pumps. And now we're introducing chargers at these locations. And it makes me wonder if this is going to be even more of a case. And with EV charging, we know that for every one stop that you might need to make in a gas car, you're likely going to have to make 2 to 3 stops on a road trip in an EV. And so now you're stopping more frequently. You have more people using these locations. And if it's a gas station or a convenience store that's there to sell items, they don't want you plugging in your car, going and using the bathroom, and then leaving, right, without buying something. So this is something that I think it might be interesting to follow, because that Dunnigan supercharger site, I think, Walter, you remember the one that I talked about? They opened it for Thanksgiving. Yeah. It's right next to a Arco AM/PM convenience store, and as I was driving by, the trash cans were completely full. Like it was clear that that site had been used. And I can only imagine if over the course of a day, this ARCO AM/PM has hundreds of people coming in wanting to use the bathroom and not buying anything because they're just stopping for 10 to 15 minutes and getting back on the road again. So this is an issue that I think we could see. Red flag now, but it's a potential future issue that I think we could see with some of these chargers and where they're being built. So
for sure. And I think one of the other things I'd be kind of curious of your guys, especially your thoughts, Eric. I know we've kind of disagreed a little bit on this in the past, but one of the things that really stood out to me on this trip again was like there could be more chargers, especially if you're off I-5, the density. And I think it's really interesting, even when I look at a lot of the maps for chargers, even PlugShare, there is such a big density change in DC fast charging west of the Missouri River. East of the Missouri River, it's so much more dense. And then if you're not along I-5, I-84, or like I-90, there's a very significant drop-off of DC fast charging density. And you do really have to kind of sometimes choose where you're going more and kind of the strategy to get some of these. And I'm curious if you have seen that or kind of experienced still yourself that, Eric. That really just stood out to me more on this trip recently, because a little bit of the detour we took through Yosemite versus some of the other ways I've gone.
Yeah, I mean, I still sort of maintain this opinion that once you breach probably 12 to 16 stalls, you've reached the point of diminishing returns. And this last trip, I guess maybe spoilers because a BP Pulse didn't exactly operate the way that I wanted it to, but it's a 4-stall BP Pulse at an ARCO AM/PM. But I was just picturing this as I was pulling off the freeway, and I'm looking, and across one street, there's another gas station. And then across the street from that, there's another gas station. And so we tend to be so fixated on how many pumps there are at a particular location or how many plugs there are at a particular location. But I would much rather have 4 stalls at the ARCO, 4 stalls at the 76, 4 stalls at the Chevron than have 12 stalls at just one location. I still maintain that. Now, what that right number is, because we do have to worry about, there has to be enough chargers and stalls to match the size of the location and the use case of the location and the business itself, and the typical dwell time. But I'm not, for a lot of these highway locations, I'm not seeing a justification for more than 6 to 8 to 12 stalls. Basically the same as gas pumps. The issue that I have more, and it still pervades, is the amount of power per stall. Because that BP Pulse, great location, 4 stalls. If all 4 stalls are in use, you're looking at a maximum of about 70 to 75 kilowatt per stall. Yeah. For a lot of EVs, what are you going to be there for an hour at an AM/PM? That's not going to fly for a lot of people. And so I'm more interested in making sure it's a balance of sufficient stalls for the location and sufficient power to match the use case of that location. So if Steve comes in his superlative charging Ioniq 5 and he wants to spend 10 minutes going into the AM/PM to grab a hot dog and use the bathroom, you're not going to do that on a 75 kilowatt charger. So the chargers need to match, and the stall count needs to match the amenities of the location.
It's cold now, and my preconditioning sucks, so I only get 70 kilowatts.
Oh,
for the
well,
first
then it's
20
perfect
minutes
for
anyway.
you.
I mean,
Come on
good
by.
stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I do see a case maybe, and this is to your point, maybe, Chase, about having some centrally located larger charging sites. But I think we need to be honest about how big they actually need to be.
And I think that's totally fair. I think a lot of the locations I was talking about, 8, 6, probably would have even been fine. It's just like once you get off that I-5, the main interstate's kind of going up and down, and maybe other than west and east on parts of the West Coast. It is just really interesting to me, like how there are still some pretty decent gaps or areas that I'm hoping. But I'm. Are you going to say? It looks like you're going to say something there, Eric.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, just a point to consider, because I've spent most of my life driving rural highways, even in California. When you go to a small gas station, it's not uncommon to see only 2 gas pumps.
Oh, for
like
sure.
Maybe 1 or 2 gas pumps. And so my thinking is, do we, on these rural highways, once you get off the interstate, do we really need more than 2 to 4 stalls per, the Casey's General Store on?
Well, what's kind of funny, speaking of that, just I guess as an anecdote, is Highway 97, which essentially starts and kind of ends around Mount Shasta and goes north through Oregon. So many, the Rivian Adventure Network, and I think for sure the Chimolt V4 that opened, the Tesla supercharger, they're at abandoned gas stations, which is so funny. And that was actually one of the other places we had an issue where, like, we pull up. I mean, it was so slick in the interface. We pull up to the Chimolt, Oregon, and it's also really in the middle of nowhere, but it's right off the highway. So we charge, and as you pull up, a thing flashes like, okay, bathroom code is like 05 something something something. I was like, slick, great integration, great. We need to use the bathroom. And then we get out of the car, we go over there, and it just says bathroom out of order, which a very unfortunate experience. The execution was fantastic, but the implementation and the reality hit hard there. But it kind of goes to exactly that point where the Rivian Adventure Network, that one's actually been there a little bit longer, but maybe a year, 18 months. There's so many that are just now like finally kind of finishing in that 97 highway and a lot of these other highways that are really core to not even just people living and like getting to places, but so much actual commerce between businesses and then also semi trucks and that whole space that I'm very optimistic. I'm very happy to see what I've seen, but I think there's still a lot of room for seeing more. There was potentially a Flying J that's going to get some hopefully soon. That there's been kind of rumors off and on along 97, but we'll see what happens there. But one of the things I wanted to kind of ask before we get into some of the other topics was, you're now starting to see, like, obviously the bleeding edge of, we talk about, Steve, you're in the Ioniq. Some of the high-end IKEA, for the most part, minus some of the cold gating issues that can occur, the charging's fantastic. And we're seeing that obviously right now kind of reset, even with the recent i90 surge thing that kind of Kyle O'Connor and that whole group out of spec did with Porsche Taycan, league of its own when it comes to charging. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts as to 2 parts of this question. The first is, do you expect that in 5 to 10 years, if maybe in roughly, like, I would say 3 to 7 years, that kind of tech we're seeing the Taycan just makes its way down anyway into more affordable EVs? And then second, one of the things I've thought is really interesting with the other side of this is the infrastructure to support it, like Iona and some of these others that are kind of coming to market. Really great to see. They're really leaning into like having a lot of or at least how they're positioning, having a lot of amenities at these sites, which seems like a good thing too. But I'm kind of curious, if we do get to this point where it is like almost or within a minute or so of gas going to these charging locations, is there the potential for like too much margin being invested into these locations that people don't really have an interest in like staying at or using? Going back to that kind of gas metric we've heard about gas stations for so long, that the longer people are at these, you see that higher transaction cost and kind of going on. So 2 questions there. Curious on your guys' thoughts.
Yeah, I do think the charging will continue to trickle down. I mean, it's not particularly expensive to get into, Ioniq 5, Ioniq 6 leases right now, so that
Fair.
technology is already at a fairly accessible level, and it's only going to get more. The batteries are going to get a little bit bigger, opening up a bit more room to increase the speed, and throttle back later. So that's exciting, but I mean, I think what really needs to be focused on is efficiency. Just being able to go further between these stops. I mean, we do it, and I think we're kind of on the edge of the people that would do it and quite like to stop and charge and see what's going on.
We are outliers.
This is a select group of nerds,
for sure.
So it's not something that, I mean, I think it's good to see the infrastructure expanding, accelerating to meet that 400, 500 kilowatts eventually, and to trickle that into cars that are accessible to people. But at the same time, I don't want to see that be the only thing that people focus on, because it's been a game changer for me, moving to an EV that can charge that quickly, but it's covering over a lot of the same range that the Bolt EV that I had did. And absent the fast charging, this would not be a massive upgrade in terms of the actual capabilities of how far I could go on that vehicle. The lengths of stint of driving that we do are very, very similar, because it's so much more inefficient than the Bolt EV, and it charges way quicker, so you get back on the road. But I don't want to see that be the be all and end all, and it's something to chase because it's the bigger number.
That's a
you
good
see
point.
this with the gravity charging hubs, 500 kilowatts. Well, fantastic, but
yeah,
at some point we don't need to do that. I mean, that gravity charging hub, to Walter's point, in New York City was, aside from me, was only charging BZ4Xs for rideshare to go around the city to do 10, 20 mile loops. So great, it's got massive fast charging, but a lot of those cars were just trickling. Then they'd go off and get a coffee for an hour. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater to get this technology down to the gas station fill-ups and then realize we actually had something very good with alternating power levels and being able to match dwell time to the amount of power you need.
You want to go first, Walter, or?
Two things. The Great Wall of the United States that's trying to block out the Chinese cars, I think eventually is going to erode. Chinese technology is advancing for charging speed. And recently I saw a Tesla Bjorn video where he was inside a Chinese EV, and it looked like a Tesla display. It was a rectangle LCD, and it had like little buttons on the bottom. Exactly. I mean, it was like a Tesla. It was very obviously reverse engineered Tesla tech. The opposite can happen. I mean, we've got crafty people over here in the United States. So either the Chinese are going to show up with their really fast charging cars, or someone in Silicon Valley is going to sit down with one of those things, pick it apart, and I don't know about copy, but anyway, the tech is there. In China, price parity has already been passed, and it hasn't. We could argue about the whole price parity, but the speed, the technology of charging speed has increased. However, like what Eric was alluding to, if I'm going to sit down and eat a meal, I'm going to be hit with astronomical dwell time charges because my car is finished in 8 minutes. Who's going to sit down at a restaurant when your car finishes in 8 minutes? You got to go into the convenience store and grab a cold burrito and run back to the car and unplug and get on the road again. So I don't know. It's a rolling debate whether or not fast charging to that extent is good or bad. And I guess it's good is rather have instead of want. But I don't know. My personal opinion is I have 155 max speed on my Volvo, and for me, it's perfectly fine. I get everywhere I need to.
And remember it's happening whilst you do those things, right? And watch how people travel when you go to your next trip over the holidays or whatever else, and you pull off at a service plaza or whatever the equivalent is where you are. See if they're rushing, see if they're first of all not stopping to go into the place. They need to use the bathroom, they do need to go and do that. See if they're just pumping gas and everybody's rushing out and coming back to the car within 2 minutes. It's not the way most people do it. Most
especially
people
with families or dogs.
Exactly, yeah, you can't do it. It's not physically possible. But even the solo or the couple that are going, they'll park up most likely, at least at the service plazas that we have, go in, maybe grab some food, snacks, whatever, do the restroom. That's probably 15, 20 minutes. They'll go out and then they'll go to the gas station on the way out, spend another 5, 10 minutes, filling up, paying, and then they'll hit the road. So what's the cumulative amount of time there, and which was more inconvenient? I mean, some people are road warriors and just need to hit the road again and go. That I understand that the huge charging curves and power levels for them will be key, but I don't think that's most Americans, honestly. I think most people travel much slower than they think they would like to.
Oh, that's very true.
Yeah, and think to that, Steve, right? That's to me, Chase. That's the real risk, is catering too much to the cannonball runners, is what I would refer to it as, because that's a very unique subset of travelers. I think you've mentioned yourself, you probably do fall into that.
For sure.
Whereas I think, to Steve's point, and I've noticed this for a long time with my Bolt EV, where I'll plug into a 50 kilowatt charger, get my strong 45 kilowatts of charging power, and I'll walk in to a restaurant and eat and come back out again to 70-80% battery, and I'll look around, and all of the same gas cars that were parked there when I arrived are still there when I leave. So, there's a massive population of people who just don't travel that way. And that's the real risk, right? Is, I think, and that was my biggest takeaway from that I-90 surge video, is the charging infrastructure has now exceeded the capabilities of the cars, right? Like, we literally saw only one car that was able to keep up with the charging infrastructure, and that was the Porsche Taycan. And if it had more range, it would have actually kept up with the Acura, the gas-powered Acura. So, like, literally the only thing, and this is maybe speaking to, Steve's point about efficiency, and to me, range is always kind of more paramount, because you're no longer reliant on infrastructure. Sure. If you had the Lucid's range with the Porsche Taycan's, charging, it would have kept up with the Acura with existing infrastructure. And that's, I think, the thing that, to me, that was the biggest takeaway. But to your other questions, Chase, like, I'll start with an anecdote, or not an anecdote, but just a saying, right? You can have fast charging, you can have long range, or you can have low cost of ownership, and you can choose any two. So you
completely agree. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because people forget. You rewind the clock 9-10 years ago, you could get a Chevy Spark EV for $20,000 that would charge from 10% to 80% in under 20 minutes. So this big, like, this big red line that we've drawn, that you need to be able to charge to 80% in 15 to 20 minutes. Well, we had EVs doing that for under $30,000 10 years ago. Now, you could only go 80 to 90 miles on a full charge, but that was the trade-off, right? So I think that's already sort of been in place. And I know, for me personally, I do not see a benefit with anything faster than a 2C charging EV. So for the way that I travel, if an EV can charge from, say, 10% to 80% in roughly 30 minutes, as long as it has close to 300 miles of range or thereabouts, that is perfect for my personal travel needs. And I think a lot of people it works for. And to me, also, speaking to that cannonball run crowd, I think one of the questions, if someone asks me what kind of EV they need or how fast it needs to charge, one of the first questions I would ask about traveling is, how much faster than the speed limit do you normally drive? Because if you just drive the speed limit, more than likely, even a slower charging EV with decent range is going to serve your needs to the point that you're not even going to really realize the difference, right? You're going to be driving for 3 hours. You're going to stop for 30 minutes, and you're going to get back on the road again and drive for another 2 to 3 hours, and you're just not even going to think about it.
For sure, and I completely agree with Steve's comment. I mean, I know we've been talking about fast charging, and I think it's probably just inherently quite a bit of what we also do focus on. But I completely agree. Like, the first things I look at really now are efficiency and range. And the more of that you have, the more you can kind of get around a lot of these DC fast charging issues, which admittedly are getting a lot better. But, and I mean, that was a big reason I chose the car I did recently. And I think that's what is so impressive too, is what we are seeing around the efficiency improvements and what we're seeing kind of consistently for vehicles on the road. And I hope that trend really does continue, just because as a consumer, it also means I'm spending less when I do have to charge it. And I can go farther on a charge and stuff like that. But I
Walter,
think
what does the Lyric do in terms of range? I always forget kind of how that compares to the charging.
312.
Okay, and is that kind of highway speeds? What are you getting?
Yeah, it's monster.
So, I mean, that's the difference. I mean, because
it drives farther than I can stand being in a car.
Yeah, I can do 200 miles in the Ioniq on a good jaunt along the Mass Pike, and it'll get me to Albany from Boston, but it's not going further than that. The Lyric would then get me to Syracuse. So, and that's you're starting. So again,
fair.
maybe I can charge faster, hooray, and I'm back on the road quicker than Walter. But Walter's already gone 100 miles more than me. So
Right.
it's just there's a trade-off there. It's just how you prefer to travel to some extent.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I'm just kind of curious. We've all talked about it a little bit, and then kind of going back to my question, we all talk about it each on our own channels, but just kind of about the rise of amenities at these charging locations. As to, do we see that? And I think we've also talked about this too. Is like, as the prices get more expensive at some of these locations that have more amenities, does that kind of start becoming a detriment, a positive, a just benefit of choice to the consumer? Or I'm curious how you guys go about it in your own kind of EV road tripping.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm weird, but I actually don't look at the prices. Like, not in terms of planning my trip, right? I drive, and then when I need to charge, I stop and charge. And then when I look at the price, I shake my fist at the sky and yell profanities. But yeah, I don't plan my trips around
That's fair.
the price of the charging. I do plan my trips around the amenities that are available at the location. But I know, Walter, you probably have something to say to this as well, because we've kind of chatted on this on the side too. But there is a real fiscal incentive for businesses to install EV chargers at this point. And when you see something like an Iona, where they're all in terms of they're building everything like that, that's a little bit of a different model, because they're fronting the costs, they're doing all of that. And they don't have an existing business that sort of supplements it. They're looking to local businesses or whatever. But in terms of, if you're a fast food chain, if you're a sit-down restaurant chain, if you're an existing established business that makes money from foot traffic, a Buc-ee's, a Pilot, a Love's Travel Center, right? When you put that charger in, it opens up the door for you to actually offer energy at a subsidized rate, because every customer that enters your door is paying 10, 15, 20% margin on whatever it is that they consume when they're at your location. So I actually see amenities and price complementing each other, in terms of, if you're talking about a charger being added to an existing business that makes decent margins off of foot traffic, they have no reason to try to then charge more than the most basic rate for power.
No, I think that makes sense. Walter, Steve, what are your thoughts into that?
Wow, I could talk for this for hours. Lots of things. So first, let me talk about a trend that I'm noticing, is that there's a divergence away from plopping chargers in convenience stores and instead building charging hubs. Steve did a really good video on that just recently, where there's an emergence of charging hubs throughout the United States. Large fossil fuel companies like Shell Oil and British Petroleum are spotted doing exactly what I'm saying. They're shuttering gas stations, and they're greenfielding charging hubs at locations that are just nothing in the ground. They're just building it from scratch. And so, divergent away from the convenience store model, they're forging a completely new path. So that is occurring. Whether or not that's going to be successful or not is yet to be determined. But my personal opinion, back to your original question, if I'm stopping to charge, I want a gas station. And I think the sleeping giant in the United States is really a collection of small, medium businesses. The lion's share of employment in the United States is not in large Fortune 50 companies. The lion's share of employment is in small, medium businesses. And when it becomes clear that, as Eric says, you can increase foot traffic and you could also receive fuel electronically without a truck to your store, and everyone starts to understand that it's an investment in dwell time, that there's going to be owner operators of convenience stores all throughout the United States clamoring to get DC fast chargers installed as fast as they can. And all of these CPOs out there that are gaining the limelight are just going to be completely swallowed up by the sea of independent operators putting in chargers at their properties. And in my opinion, that's the best place to charge, because they're already geared for me to be there. They have everything I need.
I think it's going to be interesting watching the business models. This is something to start looking at in 2025 and beyond, is what does the entity that's selling the charging have to gain elsewhere? To Eric's point, is there a property for you to go into? Are they putting amenities there so that they can service you and your family and your dog? And this, Loves is starting to really tout, dog parks and the dog rest areas at their truck stops, which is, part of the long haul trucking crowd. But the pricing is going to be, it's really interested me recently, because you're starting to see, like, on the lower end of players that are at least in multiple regions or nationwide, it's the Circle K kind of charging solution, which is a bit lower power. It's 180 kilowatts. It's not necessarily the fastest charging on the market, but they've cornered the market of kind of sub 50 cents per kilowatt hour. They're in 43 to 49 cents per kilowatt hour range wherever they're operating, and that's across the board. Then you have Tesla, who's much more of a, this is a kind of, we're doing it because we need to have the network. We built it so that people would buy the cars. And there, you have Max de Zegher, the director of charging at Tesla Charging, saying our role is to force, put downward pressure on prices to bring the industry down. So they've cut their prices a little bit recently, and starting to see downward trends there as well. And then you have the likes of Pilot Flying J, who are, as Eric said, incented to get people into the property and start to sell them things, but they're on the higher end of the, it's around 57 cents, I think Walter had said, that, for average, some of their prices go as high as 69 cents. The lowest I've seen is 45 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's mostly on the higher end. But then you have nicer amenities to an extent. You may have shelter, you may have the squeegees. So they've really built out the quality of, as soon as you plug in, you've got an experience around you. Not at every stop, but there's a lot of canopies now in Walter's slide decks that he does at the end of his Pilot Flying J updates to show you how many canopies there are and what kind of quality you're getting. So it's well lit, it's sheltered, it's fast, it's got the 24/7. So then maybe you start to think, well, all right, I'm in the middle of the night, it's the weather, in the Northeast here, it's coming down with snow. I don't really want to stop at somewhere where there's a supercharger, because a lot of those are uncovered, or a Circle K. It's cheaper, but still I'm not going to get the level of experience. Maybe I do want that Pilot Flying J in that circumstance.
Chase, can I just say something that really grinds my reduction gear?
Always.
So I recently had to fill out a JD Power survey. So every time you log in on PlugShare, a lot of times if you charge there, they'll send you
quite a few times on my recent road trip, and now even ChargeWay does consumer reports when you use it.
Yeah, and so what really bothers me about it, though, is as you go through the survey, you can tell that one of the things that they're primarily fishing for is reliability, right? Like, oh, are you here because your charging session failed somewhere else? Did your charging session here fail? Did you have problems making your payment? Were there any issues actually? What I would like to see them start asking is, did you actually use the business on site? Because that's data that really actually matters. So if you're doing a survey for an EV owner and you stopped at a Target, right? Did you shop at that Target, or did you shop at a different business nearby? Right. So if you stop at an EV Go in front of a Chipotle, did you grab yourself a burrito, or did you just sit in your car and check emails, right? So like, to me, that's the kind of data I think that they need to start gathering from consumers, because that's actually data that matters to the businesses. I think we're past the point of fishing for, oh, this charging provider only has 82.3% reliability. I'm charging there. I told you I'm charging there. Don't bother me. Ask me about what I did when I'm there, and then that's useful data for the business. So that's just kind of my take on it. I mean, I get that they're trying to give a consumer report for consumers focused on the charging provider. But I think we're also at a point now where they could be doing a better job gathering data that's actually useful for the businesses that might want to be hosting these charging providers.
Yeah, I
So
think that's a fair criticism. I do know, I mean, a lot of what they're being paid for is to get that reliability data. So I
Right.
agree with you that it's probably focusing the wrong area, but it is also its vicious cycle, because that's what they're mostly being paid for, to get that data for. But you're right, there's definitely a kind of a spring well of opportunity when it comes to actually, because that is something a lot of different business and a lot of people want to get that data and are willing to pay for it, to find out where those opportunities are for in the market. And I realize we're now coming up on an hour, and I really appreciate all this conversation. So I do want to kind of address one thing we haven't really talked about. I know this is kind of, all of you guys discuss this, but obviously kind of looking at back, today it's December 17th as we're recording this, looking back at 2024 and now kind of looking forward to 2025. Obviously there's been kind of all sorts of different announcements of what people think will or will not happen with the recent election. But I'm kind of curious, like, let's just look back real quickly at 2024 and kind of start with some of the trends and things we've seen with NEVI. And I know, Steve, you're always posting a lot of great content about that specifically. But I would love to hear maybe just like a few just just bullet points about what are some of the things that you've really, that really stood out to you in this past year, especially with kind of the NEVI implementations.
I think how much was going on underneath the surface is kind of crucial. You're starting to see now that November was the biggest month. I think it ended up with 15 activations under the NEVI program. December's lagging it obviously a bit at the moment, but if we get some builds here in the next week or two, subject to the holidays, it will match or exceed. So we'll be, by the end of the year, we're pretty close to 50 active NEVI stations. But all of that was preceded by 2 years of government agencies trying to figure out how the hell to do NEVI, what was going on. I mean, we've spoken to a
Or
few
if they
people.
were going to do it at all.
Yeah, well, yeah, some are still, if you look at your Florida or your Wyoming, you'll
Yeah.
not notice any NEVI stations popping up soon, and there's a reason for that. The states, have just not shown the interest that others have. But you'll see the leaders, the likes of Ohio, who are about a year into their implementation now, and then New York State, both had plans beforehand, right? So they had some semblance of how they were going to build out charging in their state, even before federal programs came along. They knew they wanted to do it. They knew this was the future. They just had to figure out funding. Some of it was Volkswagen Dieselgate based. Others would be state based. Whatever they had, they were starting to put plans in place. So NEVI has, for those states, just supercharged and catalyzed those efforts, because they had the plan. They said it would maybe take us 5-10 years to do this with the funds that we've got. And then they've got this big pot of money now to say, well, we want to empower travel across the country. Your state's a big part of this. Go and put charges every 50 miles. And they'll say, well, we've got the plan to do it. We've got some of them done. Let's just get all these in the ground now. So that's why you're starting to see so many pop up. I think Ohio was probably 60 or 70% of the activations last month, and Pilot Flying J has been a big part of that. So that the money is catalyzing, cross-country travel with CCS1 connectors at least, but you're starting to also see, it's kind of a leading indicator. The J3400 plugs come online. Texas had it as part of their requirement from early on, so the sites in Texas that are going live will all be, whether they're Tesla superchargers or otherwise, will all have NACS J3400 handles. You're starting to see that with Quick Trip up in Wisconsin also putting them on. So you're seeing a lot of the things that are happening outside of public funding regardless, happening in the public funded sector, just because they have to meet these requirements. So it's an interesting intersection of what would have happened anyway, but something that's been criticized for being so slow has actually really started to pick up pace now, and is kind of embodying a lot of these trends that we're seeing in the wider industry that would have been funded by the private sector.
Walter, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
Yes, I'm very interested to see how the NEVI police enforcement of charger uptime plays out. And the way I understand that hook occurs is data is required to be fed into the joint offices. I think it's the eChart database or something. I forgot the name of the database, but telemetry from chargers that records uptime, throughput rates, several other variables is all recorded into the joint office's database. And from that, it's disseminated off to the states in order to either withhold or disperse operational expenses for the NEVI stations with the awarded operators. Now, one concern I do have is that when the Trump administration takes over, they may try to cease the operation of the joint office. I'm thinking as an executive, as a part of the federal government, I'm not quite sure if that's achievable, but I do have concern. If I was a employee of the joint office right now, I'd be pretty nervous. Because there's a lot of talk about ways that the Trump administration might be able to curtail spending towards electric vehicles. And I would say the joint office is probably in the crosshairs right now. So that is a concern I have. The NEVI program itself will likely continue just because the allocation of funds has already occurred. But those roles can be rolled over into a different department. And it could definitely be become less effective, and that would be concerned. But if it does sustain, the effect of that telemetry rolling into the joint office's database, I think will have wide-standing effect for overall station reliability, because if operators are required to report that data just for NEVI stations, they'll also have similar type of expectations for the rest of their stations as well. So it will be a positive effect, ripple effect throughout the entire environment. At least that's my opinion.
I do want to kind of separate those things out as well, because the NEVI requirement is on uptime, and it's 97%, which kind of sucks. As if that's your metric, then you're not doing that great, because that's potentially a day or more out every month, which is not going to help people who roll up on that day. But I think just looping it back to Electric Era, I think they've talked about, as well as uptime, which is kind of crucial, successful charge, activation rates, SCAR. They're setting out some other metrics which I really kind of appreciated, because that's more the user level, right? If we go back to driver experience, that's what we're talking about. So yeah, it has to be up, it has to be glowing green when I arrive, great, but it also needs to start my charge without me having to futz with 3 different types of activation, or call someone to start it up. So if I'm started on my first attempt, that's another metric that I want, and I think that's laudable for anybody who's focusing on that. I think Kempower has done some good work with publishing their successes as well, because the numbers weren't that glowing for Kempower, but they literally said this is about transparency. We accept that these are great numbers, and then these are poor numbers, and this is where we're going to improve. So if we can kind of start to get that level of not just granularity, but transparency from the providers, then we start to really make some inroads into how things are actually on the ground.
Yeah, I don't know if I share Walter's optimism that data will be shared at the same level, but I think those examples of both Kempower and Electric Era that you shared, Steve, highlight why they do. And it's great sales data. While it would be great to have that data of the providers and have more transparency around that, if you are a company that's selling hardware like Electric Era or Kempower, now you're having some pretty good selling points as to why to buy that hardware. And I do agree that Electric Era has been really great about sharing their data, and a big part of that is they're trying to get more funding, they're trying to scale, and they want to highlight. And they do also have that very effective software capability to have real-time results that I think some others have definitely struggled with getting that data and having that reflective. I mean, even in the Electrify America app, I've had that experience where it's just way off of what it's telling me is live at different sites. So I would love to see that. And you're totally right. I think we've seen this by quite a few charge point operators where they have, coincidentally, kind of hidden what these numbers actually mean, especially with uptime and reliability. That, yeah, the station was up, but maybe half of those chargers were down, or you had to plug in twice to get exactly to what you're talking about. So like, what was the actual experience, or how does this kind of work into that? There's a lot of ways that you can unfortunately use data to say the wrong message. and how can we increase that transparency of the data to find the truth. And I hope what Walter is saying comes to fruition. But historically, I have yet to be more optimistic.
So speaking of that, maybe I should say a couple of negatives about NEVI. I do actually think NEVI hurt the charging infrastructure development, I think, for at least a year and a half to 2 years. I think there's a lot of people that were building chargers, and knowing that these funds were in the wings, they paused because
For sure.
maybe we're going to get access to this. Maybe we can get in on this. Maybe we can offset our costs. And that's an unfortunate side effect of promising funds that aren't going to be available for several years into the future. But the other sort of unspoken, I think it doesn't get enough acknowledgement, is the confusion about funding. And I see this within a lot of the EV community, especially ones from people who are pushing certain sort of tribalism, certain sort of brands, because it's like, oh, so-and-so isn't paying for chargers, or, oh, so-and-so isn't building chargers, right? They don't really care about EV owners. And now that NEVI funds are here, oh, suddenly it's GM is building chargers, right? And I've seen this a lot with the Pilot Flying J. And, Walter can speak to this too. There's a completely different funding channel for a lot of those Pilot Flying J's that has nothing to do with NEVI. There are a lot that are now NEVI, but they're going to build them regardless. If they get NEVI funds, great. But otherwise, no GM is actually putting money into these charging sites. Mercedes is putting money into these charging sites. These aren't just automakers that are leaving, EV owners to strand for themselves. They're actually committing a lot of funds and a lot of resources. And unfortunately, there's an aspect of this where now people are conflating NEVI with work that other charging providers, other automakers are actually doing, that in my opinion, they should be getting credit for. And not to get too political about it, but it was something that rubbed me the wrong way, that President Biden was talking about how, oh, we've put in hundreds of thousands of plugs. Who's we? Right? Like these were put in before you. These were funded before you. You had nothing to do with them. Now, you can take credit for the NEVI and the Infrastructure Act, but things that come after. But when we're talking about, there's a lot of people who did a lot of hard work that, yeah, could they have done better job? Probably, but they deserve credit, I think. Credit where credit's due to a lot of these charging providers and automakers who put in, some skin in the game, as they say. And so while I'm impressed by NEVI and I like to see the funding and the build out, I don't want to take away from the charging providers that really did start laying the groundwork for it and putting that, putting infrastructure in ahead of the NEVI funding.
Yeah, I think that is a fair call out, just because that's a conversation we've definitely had on this channel quite a bit with Lauren McDonald and others about there is kind of, call it the monkey's paw, or unintended negative consequences that comes out with this, where we were seeing a couple of years ago, definitely more rollout of DC fast chargers outside of across different groups. And then there was a big step back and kind of scale back and kind of slow down around where those funds and execution was being focused by these private companies. Now, I would say 2024 was the year, especially the last 6 to 8 months, this has really changed, where there is no longer that, like, it just kind of got to the point where, and I think some of that was also just the business climate, where it's like, we can't wait to get NEVI funds. If we can get them, great. But I kind of think the market actually forced a lot of these companies' hands, with some going out of business, some merging, by having to, like, if we can get the funds, great. If we can get these approvals, great. But we actually have to get chargers on the ground.
And I would say, in the specific case of Pilot Corporation, is owned by Warren Buffett, they're very well funded. They NEVI funds, okay, they're there, that's nice, but without them, they're still building chargers.
And they're not a big winner. I mean, they look big at the moment because Ohio won so many and started off early. But I think Walter has said now there's 100 plus, 120, 12 was the last count. It goes up every week, and that's not purely because of NEVI. That maybe 10-15% of chargers had some NEVI funding, but even then it's usually an 80-20 match or some level of matching from the private entity. So they've still put money into that. They've just got some offset from the government to help them. And then you look at to Eric's point, you look at a Loves, who are the equivalent of Pilot, and in a lot of similar places they're only just starting. And we know from the kind of testimony that some of the execs have said that we need government help, we're waiting for this. So the reason that Pilot is at 112 and that Loves is at 1 or 2 now is because they waited, and Pilot's way ahead of the game. They just said, well, we'll get money if we can, but we're spending it, and I think Loves is like 3rd or 4th in the total NEVI fund awards list, and that's just why they waited a bit longer and they're behind now. Pilot Flying J is the one that people associate with a really good charging experience. Loves is like, well, maybe one day.
Well, and there are 2 wings of the GM Energy network, right? So there's the EV Extend with Pilot Flying J, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of 350 kilowatt GM Energy charging sites that have already been deployed over the last 2 years that have no affiliation with Pilot at all. So
in Ayana,
oh.
Huge introduction into the charging space. Again, no federal funds, but my personal opinion, as Steve said, as Eric said, there was a pause button with NEVI, but I think Steve will attest we're now past the pause, and NEVI funds are getting dispersed and chargers are getting activated. So it's really the golden age of DC fast charger installs coming up here for 2025, in my opinion.
Yeah, once they win the awards, they got to get them in the ground so they can get the money. Operating and maintenance, cash. So, yeah, now they're incentivized.
So, looking forward now to 2025, I'm kind of curious for each of your thoughts as to what are some of the things that, or I guess real quickly, are there any things that really surprised any of you about kind of 2024 in the EV in general, kind of automaker, or like DC fast charging space? Were there any things that really kind of caught you guys or surprised you in this past year?
I'll go first. VinFast pumping the brakes with the North Carolina factory was a big surprise for me, and their production is still coming out of Vietnam. For the short term, there was a big announcement for the factory in North Carolina, and I thought VinFast was going to be an emerging brand throughout the North American market. And although you see them on occasion, they're still very small, and all the cars are still being made in Vietnam. So for me, that was a big surprise.
I was going to say, so the sort of failures of FreeWire and Tritium were a bit of a surprise to me. And then since I've been on such a Debbie Downer note, one of the things that I haven't liked seeing is a lot of these stranded assets, and it's a bit of a concern to me right now. There are some of them that are like the free wires and things like that are like the actual chargers have just gone down. But we had some older stuff here in California too, like the charge points. And then there's some networks that I'm worried about. Chase, I know you had a great experience with EVCS. And then there's also
I would like to see them go away.
And then there's also there's also EV Gateway. Kyle on Autospec did a fun trip up I-5 in the old Model S, and he stopped by that EV Gateway. I've actually used that site in Reading. Stranded hardware now, and then they also have the one at the Pitt River Casino that looks like it may never be powered on. And it looked like maybe it was just a funding grab. They put chargers in the ground and never activated them. And that's sort of a disturbing thing for me to see is you go through all of this, you do 95% of the work, and then you just leave stranded assets in the ground. And then what? So I'm really curious in 2025 to see if we see that trend continue, grow, or maybe see someone working really hard to kind of take over some of those stranded assets and fix them up and repair them.
Completely agree. And I guess to give historical context with EVCS, I would love to see them succeed. They have just consistently disappointed me and been the bane of my existence whenever I've decided to use one. And just, I guess, for personal and contextual history, they had won. There's a thing called the West Coast Electric Highway that was built about a decade ago. And Oregon, I believe Washington, and I believe parts of Northern California had, I got to work with some of the team and help with some of the promotion of the original locations for these chargers, which were great, go through a lot of beautiful parts of the state, and received decent amount of funds. And then 5 or 6 years ago, they got more state funds to be upgraded because unfortunately they were old Aero Environment ones and a lot of them gone down. They were replaced with EVCS, and the experience has been similar. And if anything, it just did not seem like a great execution of future proofing, unfortunately. And I hope that changes. So,
helping
go for it.
positivity, I guess.
Yeah.
One thing that I maybe thought was not going to go as well as it has was GM's expansion of its electric vehicle stable. This time last year we were talking about the Bolt going away, for its hiatus, and this year, that was something like 75-80% of their sales at the time. They were having problems with the rollout of a lot of the formerly Ultium, now just whatever they're calling them, BEV3 models. And actually, now that you fast forward 12 months, the Lyrics sold great guns. The Equinox EV is the most affordable on the market. Great deals on that. They've got them all out. And if you look at their roster across the board, that's the most diverse electric stable, from the not quite there to back to the Bolt EV yet, but certainly the Equinox EV on the affordable end, through Blazer and Lyric, through the Silverado EV at the top end, all of them getting great reviews for what they're at. I thought I always have been on GM's roster as a solid kind of plan, but I didn't think they would deliver within 12 months, honestly.
But did you include the Escalade IQ?
I didn't even include the Celestique.
Or the Prologue.
Yep.
The Prologue seems to actually be popular. I have seen those around, and I'm guessing they must have a really good lease deal going. And I think they actually look decent. I'm kind of curious if either anyone has heard. I have seen a lot of anecdotal data about some of the GM EVs being on dealerships longer than the dealers would like. And I haven't paid attention to the last quarter of their sales, and I'm just kind of curious what you guys seem to be a bit more plugged into the GM sphere, and I'm kind of curious what you guys have heard or seen around the sales and experience with these new. I think I completely agree with you. I think it's great that there has been a expansion of the product and seeing so many more options for people at different price points, different lifestyles, different makes of vehicles. I am worried when companies like this do that and the public hasn't maybe been. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm afraid that if sales aren't going well, that the company may then make incorrect guesses as to why that is, as we've seen from some automakers, and then change their tactic or do other things. So I'm kind of curious if, beyond anecdotal data and like experience with, because I know the trucks for sure have definitely been on the lots a lot longer than the dealers have wanted. I'm curious with your guys' experience or any hard data, especially, but anecdotal data around moving of these vehicles.
Well, I don't know about the trucks, or I mean the data specifically, other than maybe if you're talking about like the Hummer EV in particular. Because I think, as far as I know, the Silverado EV is still moving very quickly. But in the case of the Hummer EV, you're talking about, I feel like, a very limited market, and a $100,000 plus vehicle, right? So
no one's buying those. They are leasing them. When I was just down in Scottsdale, Phoenix, I saw more Hummers than I've ever seen, and I am convinced no one actually bought them. There's just really good lease deals, and that's like the place to have a flashy vehicle.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I do see EVs on GM lots now, and I would also worry about that because we saw the backlash for Ford.
Yeah,
where we had these dealerships marking up these EVs like $10,000, $15,000 because they thought they could get away with it, and then there was backlash, and then people just and it wasn't that Ford was losing sales necessarily, but those dealerships were. And I've seen a lot of backlash against a lot of GM and Chevy dealerships for just overpriced vehicles in general
sure.
across
For
the
sure.
lineup. So it's not restricted to just the EVs. But yeah, I haven't seen a lot of data. I just know that for me personally, with my experience buying Chevys and Chevy EVs in particular, there's only a handful of dealerships that I would ever consider going to, out of hundreds, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes this might just be a problem of the dealerships making. And so if they're not going to do a good job selling cars or EVs specifically, then they're going to end up with EVs stuck on their lot for longer than other dealerships that are working with customers. So, yeah.
And I would say that this year, 2024, is the first year in 15 that non-Tesla sales outnumber Tesla sales in the domestic EV market, and General Motors family of brands leads that charge. So I'm not quite sure what you've heard, but the reporting from the investor relations slide deck indicates that the sales of electric vehicles in General Motors is surpassing expectations. And I think the Cadillac brand in particular would be a shell of what it currently is if EVs didn't exist.
Cadillac may be definitely one that's not doing differently. And once again, I love hearing that. I love data versus anecdotal. I just know there have been some of the dealerships have struggled, especially. It sounds like we're already seeing, at least in these few cases, some of the Silverados and others being just kind of building up in inventory on dealership lots,
I
similar
think
to
it's
kind of what we
one
saw
to
with the
watch for the end
GMC.
of the year, right? Because you'll start to
Yeah.
see everyone will get the analysis once we get all the numbers in. But I
Yeah.
think it's going to be really interesting to see where things have overlapped there with brands coming back with the overall brand and
Yeah.
what their EV
And-
stable looks like.
And returning guest John McElroy always has a great saying about this: that no car stays on a dealership lot.
Yeah.
They all go eventually. It's whether the dealership's happy about it or not, and that has those kind of longer term ramifications.
Well, and I was going to say, just to close out on this, Chase, speaking of anecdotes versus data, I was following the Bolt EV very closely about 3 or 4 years ago, as would be normal as my thing. And I was seeing a lot of anecdotal stories of Bolt EVs, hundreds of Bolt EVs on dealership lots, languishing on dealership lots. And then I looked up the data, and the Chevy Bolt EV was 7th among all cars for the shortest time period in inventory. So there were only 6 cars in all of America that were selling faster than the Bolt EV relative to inventory. Yet at that same time, I was hearing anecdotal stories about Bolt EVs languishing on dealership lots. So data versus anecdotes, yeah, I want to dive into the data a little bit more, but
Totally
this
fair.
wouldn't be the first time that I've heard that about GM EVs not selling when the actual data says the exact opposite.
And that's great. And just to clarify, this isn't like headlines, because I no longer trust really any auto related headlines. This is purely like people in the space and moving it. But no, I think that's a great call, and that really is great to hear. I think with that, since we've already hit the 90-minute mark, I want to be optimistic. I'm naturally an optimistic person, even though this episode does not sound like I have been. So like looking forward to 2025 real quickly, I would love to just kind of hear what you're hoping to see, or any kind of optimistic things or trends you're expecting going in, and maybe that we might see in 2025. Walter, I'll let you kick it off.
Please. Boy,
Yeah.
I've been hearing a lot of doom and gloom because of the change in administration and decapping EVs and that type of stuff. But what I'm seeing is vast amount of private capital getting invested in EV infrastructure. And when I say vast, I mean very large global players getting into the North American market, implementing DC fast charging hardware in order to accommodate the inevitable wave of transition to electrification of the transportation sector. And who's in the White House has apparently, to these people who are spending the money, no bearing, because the number of very large scale projects that are currently simultaneously in swing is truly staggering. I don't think anything has been like this, at least in my lifetime. I've never seen anything like this. It's remarkable. And so the doom and gloom, I just don't see it. There's too much cash getting poured into electric vehicle infrastructure.
Yeah, on the infrastructure side, I'd echo that. I don't think anything's stopping this now. That horse is fully bolted and has got an entire stampede of partners on the plains now to extend that metaphor. I do.
So see, how far can you go with that? There's quite a few good ones.
Thinking South Dakota plains, and now I've run out of space. On the EV sales side, I think we may see more spikes and plateaus, because obviously, if the credit goes away, you're going to get a whole lot of people buying up to the point where that does get capped, and then you may see things tail off because of that. I don't think it's going to be a long-term decline. I think it's just there will be plateaus in any technology uptake, and I think this is going to be one of those where you do hit a wall. We'll probably get negative headlines for 3 to 6 months, and then it'll start climbing again towards the end of the year, perhaps. But just expect that that's going to be the case.
Great call in for sure.
Well, how about this for gloom and doom to close? We keep poking the bear in the Middle East. Oil goes up to $500 a gallon or a barrel, and the people look around and say, "Why couldn't I have been driving an EV this whole time?" Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to get rid of subsidies, I don't mind. But like Elon said, get rid of all subsidies, right? Stop subsidizing the fossil side as well. Then I'm good.
Yeah, no, I've believed that for the last couple of decades. Maybe this administration will change that, but it seems like they have friends in certain places that disagree with them.
If any administration is going to poke the bear, that's this one.
I think there is a lot to be optimistic about, not just on the charger infrastructure, because I completely agree with that, but also, as we've kind of discussed this evening, is just around automakers and availability of different products and what we're seeing coming to market, and as far as the actual technology is improving. And yeah, there are headlines. Yeah, there is. I think the biggest thing that has been missing since day one is still missing is actually education. The thing that's changed since day one is the technology and availability of the product and also the infrastructure. And I think we're starting to see that with some of the traditional legacy automakers are getting better on that. And then also just talking to friends and people that may be curious about EVs that are now seeing others down their street that have them in the driveway. And I'm kind of of the mindset, if a lot of the federal funding goes away, either way, whatever. I completely agree with what you were saying earlier too about like it's already kind of out there between the infrastructure and also the vehicles. This is not the GM EV1 sort of, and maybe that's also why I am holding that against them still. This is not like, oh, it's going to go away. There's just too many different people that EVs are obviously going to continue to grow. And one of the big things we talked about in 2024 was just like all the negative headlines about EVs. And yet it's and I think this probably had been among many over the years, but this was actually one of the larger reasons I was just over auto journalism was the fact that everyone covered that EVs were not working, but specifically they were not growing as fast as they were projected, but they were still growing. And the actual auto industry, especially globally and here in North America, was actually shrinking faster than anyone had expected this past year to happen. And that part of the math wasn't being covered. And that's the big part of the math. The fact you're having any growth should be a positive headline. And so I think we're really going to continue to see this happening. I would love to see more $20,000 cars that have Taycan level of charging. I don't think that's going to happen in 2025. But realistically, and I think for the most people, I would just love to see, as you've kind of said, Steve, like the big things really are range and efficiency. And battery prices really did take a nosedive. I think between technology advances, manufacturing increases, and everything else, we're going to continue to see that in 2025. So I hope the battery range and costs coming down are then taken advantage of with good efficiency in car design, and then charging kind of could still be not 100% perfect to what people would like, but a lot of those problems go away, especially if you have in some of the advances we've seen with level 2 charging improvements and some of the people we've even had on our podcast making that easier. And as long as you can charge day to day, I think even though I think I'm looking at kind of my boxes of this thing, I feel like Steve and Walter at top, and then myself and Eric are at the bottom, and we've been like the doom and gloom ones, kind of saying all the negativity. I think all of this going forward, though, for people listening, is really great. We're going to a great year of opportunity, whatever happens to incentives. And as we even had on a recent podcast, Albert Gore, not to be confused with Al Gore, it was very tempting to do all sorts of fun SEO stuff with that. Of the Zero Emission Transportation Alliance even shared with us that so many of these incentives are in place are no longer really the original incentive for EVs. They are now incentives for batteries that consumers just happen to be able to take advantage of. When the $7,500 bill came out, it was to sell EVs. Now it's to buy things with American-made batteries. And so there's still a good argument that a lot of these incentives, maybe consumer-facing will go away, but the back end of the manufacturing will stay because so many are in red states. But I do just feel like, as we've said this evening, that all of that could go away. And we're still in such a strong position for the continued growth that we've seen this past year to, if at the very least, continue, but more likely accelerate. With that, I just want to say, Steve, Walter, and Eric, thank you so much for coming on this evening. This was a great conversation. Always really enjoy listening to your separate channels, and great to have you on again.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Chase.
Huge thanks again to Steve Birkett from Plug and Play EV, Walter Schulze of the Network Architect channel, and Eric Way from News Coulomb for joining us today. I really appreciate their insights into the challenges, opportunities, and trends shaping the electric vehicle and charging landscape. All of them are voices in the industry that I recommend you follow if you're not already. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Steve, Walter, and Eric's channels, plus all the resources mentioned in today's episode. From the current state of EV charging to the state of EV models across price points, we've covered a lot of ground. If there's one thing this conversation proves, it's that the momentum behind electrification isn't slowing down, it's charging full speed ahead into 2025. If you enjoyed this episode, help us keep the energy flowing. Share it with a friend, colleague, or fellow EV enthusiast who needs to hear these insights. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. Please leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. It's the best way to support Grid Connections and ensure we keep bringing you the conversations that matter. Thanks again, and this is the Grid Connections podcast signing off.